Hi all, welcome to the Goldi Yarn channel where I'll be showing you through how to assemble Cameron the Crayfish pattern. Now please be aware this is a very complex pattern and the tail assembly may just drive you insane. Okay, so as you can see here there are a lot of different components to make up this crayfish. But first of all, just take the first tail section, top and bottom. So these should be the smallest tail sections you have. To make the first tail section, line up the last rows of the top tail section and bottom tail section with each other and pin the two ends of those rows together, making sure that you can see the top stitching on that last row. Repeat this for the bottom row of both the top and bottom tail sections so they are nicely in line, and place a pin in the center to hold it nicely firmly in place so the bottom tail section is nice and flat and the top tail section is nice and curved. Now to stitch the top and bottom tails together, you just need to take the yarn tail from the bottom tail section and stitch it halfway up that overlapping tail section. And then take the other remaining yarn tail from the bottom section, stitch it to the other side of the bottom tail and repeat it on the other side. So this should mean there should be about half of the bottom tail section not attached to the top of the tail section. And it should be nice and firmly stitched. Don't fasten off yet, as you'll be able to use the rest of that yarn tail later on. So next you want to put the tail fins into the bottom end of that tail section, so that open end there. So first of all, get the largest tail fin and place it in the center of the tail. So basically you want it to be attached to the top tail section at the moment, and then later on we'll attach the bottom tail section. After this, lay out the next biggest tails and place them next to it, and then place the next size after that again next to it again, but making sure it's evenly spaced throughout the tail section so they can all fit in that gap evenly. Once pinned in place, we're going to stitch them onto that top tail section of the tail, and once happy with that, we'll then stitch the bottom tail section onto the fins. So for the second tail section, you just need to make it in the same way as the first tail section by lining up the bottom and top tail, but remove the pins at the end of the tail sections. This is to allow the first tail section to sit inside the second tail section. So you want the second tail section top to be over top of the first tail section and the bottom of the second tail section to be underneath the first tail section. Pin the two tail sections together, making sure that the second tail section covers around 1 to 2 rows of the first tail section, and make sure the tail is nice and even. Once happy with the tail position, pin the base of the tail of the second section down onto the overlapping section of the first tail section, and then you want to stitch along up to halfway again like you did for the first tail section. Next, you want to finish stitching up the base of the first tail section. So basically you want to stitch through both the first and second top tail sections, so it's still got a gap remaining, and then stitch up to the top of the bottom tail section on the first tail. Once you've stitched the top of the base section on the first tail section, you'll notice there is still a gap between the two tail sections, so please do not fasten off your yarn tail yet, as you'll be using that later on in the piece to close up these two holes once we've finished stuffing and completing the rest of the tail. And now repeat it all again for the third tail section, but just make sure you cover around 3 to 4 rows of the second tail section with the third tail section in this case, as this part of the tail curves more. And make sure you stuff the tail as you go. Just make sure you're about half a tail section below where you're stitching at the time to make sure your stuffing doesn't get in the way. For the fourth tail section, make sure it overlaps the third tail section by around 4 to 5 tail sections. This is the part that bends the most, so it's best to have a base overlap for it. For the fifth and final tail section, make sure it overlaps around 2 to 3 rows with the fourth section. Next, we're going to look at restricting the movement of the tail so the stuffing doesn't come out. We do this by looking at the top of the tail and inserting the needle with the yarn in the edge between the top of tail 1 and the bottom of tail section 2. Put it just at the very top of tail section 1. Close the tail so it is nice and straight and push it out at that point on tail section 2. and then pull it out and over and pull through the other side. Bend the tail again so you can just see the top of tail section 1 and repeat the process again. Keep repeating this step until you're right at the end of the tail, making sure you keep it quite loose stitches and checking as you go that the tail can still move but doesn't expose too much of the stuffing. Once you're happy with this, fasten off at the end of the tail and thread in the remaining yarn tails. Repeat this step for the other sections of the tail so that all sections of the tail can now bend without showing the stuffing in between the layers. To fill in the gaps in the bottom of the tail, insert your needle at the bottom of section 2 and bend the tail so you can see the top. Then straighten out the tail again and push through the opposite section of tail 1. Push back through tail section 1 and bend the tail so you can see the top of tail section 2 again, and repeat this process along the tail. Keep repeating this until you reach the end and fasten off. Repeat this process for all sections of the tail so that you can bend the tail without any stuffing showing. And now you should have completed the entire tail. Make sure all the ends are weaved in apart from at the very top. And make sure as you bend it you can't see any of the stuffing. If you do, just go back with some extra yarn and stitch over those sections a bit tighter until you're happy with the bending and happy with what is exposed. Now we'll move on to making the horns on the body. So first of all, insert the biggest horns into the gaps on the body, making sure that the horns on the body itself cover the first 1 to 2 rows of the horns you're inserting. Make sure these horns are even and are in line with each other when you pin them in place. To be able to bend the horn, you want to make sure you stitch the horn in only around 4 places in the kind of square shape. This will allow the horn to bend in different directions, but still be tight enough to keep the stuffing in. So stitch around the horn, making that square shape, making sure you go through both the horn on the body and the horn attached. Once you've finished going around the horn, maybe do an extra stitch just to secure it again and bend the horn afterwards to make sure no other gaps are available. Do some more stitching if required, but do make sure you can still bend the horn nicely. Don't forget to repeat this on the other side. Now place the smaller set of horns inside the previous horns and repeat the steps you've just done for the last horns, again making sure that as you bend them you cannot see through the horns but they still have good movability. Next we want to look at the feelers, so attaching another chenille stick to one of the end feelers so it can go all the way through the horns and out the other side. This is so we can attach the second feeler to it and make sure they're both attached to each other, meaning they can both be pulled up and down and stay in place better. So place the first healer into the horn so the first 1 to 2 rows are covered. Then attach the chenille stick to the end of the second feeler. Now pull the chenille stick into the horn until the feeler is 1 to 2 rows covering into that one. Then we're going to twist the chenille stick so there's no slack between the 2 feelers. So this is just doing a clockwise motion to twist that chenille stick until it is all tight and the 2 feelers are nicely staying in place without flopping all over the place. Next, pin these feelers in place so they can bend comfortably and then stitch around the circumference of the feelers. So next we want to stitch the eyes onto the crayfish. We want to do this just after the biggest spike on the head, just so they're above it and just slightly to the side. So to stitch on the eyes, you want to go a stitch just in front of the biggest spike and then to the stitch below it. So starting off from that center point there and stitching 1 further down. So push the yarn through the middle and come out to that point just above that first big spike. Thread it through and then attach the bead to that yarn. Once your bead is attached, then you're going to thread the needle below the next stitch, so just 1 row down into that next stitch pole there. Once you have done the stitch, pull it nice and tight and make sure you're happy with the eye placement. And to give it extra security, I'd suggest stitching through it 1 more time. Now you've stitched through the eye twice, repeat this process on the other side of the eye. Once you've done both eyes, then stitch your yarn together and push it through the body so that you can no longer see the yarn tail. Then stuff the body, including the horns, so use a crochet hook to be able to reach the top of those horns. The rest of the assembly for the crayfish is rather straightforward. You can probably use a pattern for the rest of this, but I'll just talk through the photos if that helps as well. So for the leg, make sure the first section has the last 2 rows covered by the second section, and make sure it is the first rows of the second section that covers it, not the other way around, otherwise you might have the leg upside down. Now using the yarn tail of the first section, stitch the second section onto it, going around the entire circumference, knotting it at the end, and stitching through that yarn tail through until it's no longer visible. Also make sure you weave in the yarn tail ends of the second section. Repeat this for all the other legs. For the claws, you want to have the second claw section facing the same way as you did for the legs, with the last row facing towards the end. Make sure the second claw overlaps the first 1 to 2 rows of the first claw, and repeat the steps in the previous section for the legs by stitching the second section on to the first section, making sure you weave in the tail ends as you go. Take the third section of the claw and make it overlap the last half a row of the second round, making sure it is faced in the way that it's actually the last row of the third claw that faces toward the second part of the claw. Pin these in place and stitch around the circumference as you did before, making sure you weave the yarn tail of one of those ends to the base of the claw so it can be used for stitching later on. Now all the legs and claws have been stitched together, we are going to arrange them on the body, starting with the smallest legs towards the end of the body and going upwards to the big claws. Make sure the claws themselves are facing with the spike facing out away from the body, and check that afterwards that all the claws and legs ends are covered by the belly. Once you're happy with the leg placements, making sure they look all even, then stitch the legs onto the body using the yarn tail. As you go, make sure you actually twist all the different chenille sticks remaining together to help hold them in place. Once all the legs are stitched on, and making sure they do not move after the pins are removed, place the belly plate on top of the legs, making sure the belly is nice and straight and the end of the belly plate just overlaps the end of the body so it can curve around and over the end. Using the yarn tail of the belly plate, stitch the belly plate onto the legs and onto the body, making sure it's nice and tight and still in line with the center of the body. Now pin the tail into the body, making sure the body covers around 1 to 2 rows of the tail. Pin it in place, making sure it is even all the way around and the tail is not skewed to one side. Cut an extra length of the Shiraz colour and stitch the top of the tail onto the body using a similar method to what you did for the top of the tail to allow some movement of the tail onto the body. For the bottom of the tail, use the cream yarn tail of the bottom tail and stitch it on to the base plate of the body, making sure as you go that the tail still remains nice and straight. And now we're up to pinning the pleopods onto the bottom of the tail. Pin 4 pleopods onto either side of the tail, making sure they are pinned facing upwards and angled slightly downwards. So the shortest edge of the pleopod should be facing towards the edge of the tail, and they should be just under the edge of each tail section. Using the yarn tail of the pleopods, stitch the pleopods onto the tail and removing the pins as you go, making sure they do not move too much. And congratulations, you've completed making Cameron the Crayfish. And thank you so much for making this pattern.